She found him face down in the creek bed and almost kept walking. Almost. The creek was low, barely knee-deep at the center, ankle-deep where he'd gone down, and the light was bad, just the tail end of a moon that kept sliding behind cloud. Nora had been moving for 3 hours. Her boots were wrong for this terrain. Her lip had stopped bleeding sometime around the 2nd hour, but the swelling pulled when she breathed through her mouth, which she had to do because her nose was still half-blocked with dried blood. She was not in a condition to help anyone. She stopped anyway. He was face down. That was the thing. Face down in 2 inches of water, arms out, not moving. A man could drown in 2 inches of water if he was too far gone to lift his head. She knew this. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did, the way you know certain things about the world that you'd rather not. She looked up and down the creek. Empty. Looked at the ridge. Nothing. Looked back at him. She went in. The water was cold enough to take her breath. She waded the 6 feet to where he lay and grabbed his shoulder and pulled, and he was heavy in the way of someone who was all of themselves and not one bit less. She hauled and got him rolled over and got his face out of the water, and then she sat back on her heels in the creek and breathed. He was burning. She could feel it through her hands. Fever hot in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. His face was drawn tight with it, the muscles around his jaw working against something she couldn't see. He was dressed in a way she'd never seen up close, buckskin, beaded, a belt with a pouch at the hip, and he was tall, even prone, in a way that was going to make moving him a problem. She moved him anyway. It took longer than it should have. She got him to the bank by degrees, pulling and repositioning, until she had him on solid ground with his head tilted away from the water. His breathing was audible. Wrong. The kind of breathing that had too much work in it. She should have kept walking. She'd told herself she was going to Prescott. She had $11 and a tin cup and a knife she wasn't entirely sure she could use. Prescott was 20 miles east and the road was watched, and she'd gotten off the road for that reason and gone cross-country through the canyon, and now she was standing in a wet skirt in the dark next to a man who might die before morning. She knelt down and looked at him properly. His shirt had 2 buttons. One was cracked across the middle, a clean fault line that hadn't finished splitting. The other 2 were missing. She counted them. 2 buttons, 1 cracked. The shirt was soaked through, sticking. She counted the buttons again because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her caught up. She was not going to leave a man to die in a creek bed. She hadn't been able to locate the version of herself that would do that, and she'd spent 3 hours looking. She built a fire 20 feet from the water, behind a bend in the canyon wall that would hide most of the light from the ridge. Small fire. Careful fire. She was good at careful. She'd been careful for 4 years on Holt's Ranch, careful about where she stood and how loud she was and which topic she let herself wander near, and it had not saved her lip or her eye or the 3 ribs she was still favoring, but it had kept her alive, and alive was the only currency she currently had. She went back for him. Dragged him, really, a few feet at a time, stopping to check the ridge. He made a sound once, low in his chest, that she felt in her back teeth. She kept moving. By the time she got him near the fire, he was shaking. She had 1 coat. She weighed that fact the way you weigh things when you don't have enough of them. Then, she took it off and put it over him and told herself the fire would be enough, which it wouldn't be, but it was what there was. His shirt was the problem. Wet cloth against a fever was a fast way to make things worse. She'd seen the 2, she'd seen a lot of things she catalogued without meaning to, in the part of her brain that had apparently been preparing for emergencies her entire life. She worked the remaining buttons loose. Pulled the shirt off him carefully, the way you'd handle something that could still hurt you. He didn't wake. She laid the shirt near the fire to dry. Looked at the coat she'd just put over him. Looked at her own arms in the firelight. She poked the fire instead of thinking about it. She had half a biscuit in her coat pocket. She left it there. She had the tin cup, which she filled from the creek upstream of where he'd been lying, and boiled over the fire, and let cool, because boiled was safer. Everyone knew boiled was safer. She didn't know how to get him to drink it while he was under. She held the cup and listened to the canyon wind through the upper rocks. Her own fire, steady. His breathing, which was getting slightly less wrong as the warmth reached him. She put the back of her hand to his forehead. Not her palm was rough-skinned and calloused, and she didn't trust it for temperature. The back of her hand, the way she'd seen the doctor's wife do it for her youngest when he'd run a fever so high his eyes had gone glassy. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and held it there. He was very hot. Less so than before, maybe, by a small amount. Or she was telling herself that. She sat back and looked at the buttons on the drying shirt. 2 missing, 1 cracked. The weave of the buckskin was close and even. She traced it with her eye, row by row, following the pattern until her breathing evened out. She did not sleep. She fed the fire by small increments and listened to the canyon and watched him breathe and counted the buttons again, which was a stupid thing to do when there were only 3, but her mind needed the work. Sometime around what she judged to be 2 in the morning, he moved. Not sick moving, not the involuntary shift of fever. Deliberate. His hand went first, reaching for something at his hip that wasn't there. Then, he pushed himself upright, or tried to, and she went still the way she'd learned to go still, completely, not a sound. He was upright and looking at her. She held up both hands. He looked at her hands. Looked at her face. Looked at the coat that was his because she'd put it on him, and the fire, and the drying shirt. His eyes moved over all of it and then came back to her, and she could not read anything in them except that he was taking a full accounting. He lay back down. She put her hands in her lap. Her heart was doing something architectural in her chest, constructing something load-bearing out of a material she didn't trust. She poked the fire. He slept again. She watched him sleep and thought about Prescott and the $11 and decided she'd sort it out when the sun came up. The fever broke just before dawn. She knew because the shaking stopped and his breathing changed, dropped down into something quieter and deeper. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and it was warm now instead of burning. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky going gray above the canyon rim. She didn't leave. She didn't examine that. She fed the fire its last piece of wood and watched the light come and told herself she was waiting for full daylight to travel, which was practical and true, and also not the whole truth. She filled the tin cup again. Set it near enough that he could reach it when he woke. Sat back down. The canyon went pink at the top, then orange, and she heard horses at the ridgeline, far off, moving away. Her whole body went tight and then loose again when the sound faded. He was watching her. She didn't know when he'd woken. He was lying still, coat up to his chest, and watching her with eyes that were clear now, the fever fog gone out of them. "You stayed," he said. His voice was low and careful. The English was plain and direct, no decoration on it. She picked up a stick and poked at the fire. There wasn't much left to poke. Fire needed tending, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, he closed his eyes and slept again. By the time the moon was full overhead, she'd built a fire she didn't want anyone to see. That had been hours ago. Now the fire was coals, and the moon was dropping, and Koana was awake. Not all the way awake. In and out. She'd gotten water into him twice small amounts, careful, and both times he'd surfaced enough to drink and then gone back under. The third time he surfaced, he stayed. He lay on his back looking up at the canyon walls above the fire for a long time. She could see him taking stock. What he had, what was missing, what the situation was. She watched him do it and recognized the process. "How long?" he said. Not "how long have I been here?" Just, "how long?" Like he could do the math from whatever number she gave him. "I found you maybe 4 hours before dawn," she said. "It's close to midday now." He processed that. His eyes moved to the coat across his chest, her coat. To the shirt drying on a rock by the fire. To the tin cup within reach. To her face. "You're not afraid," he said. She almost laughed. The tin cup was sitting between them and she picked it up and looked at it and set it back down. "I'm very afraid," she said. He seemed to find that reasonable. He didn't tell her she shouldn't be. She gave him a point for that without deciding she was giving him points. He slept again after that. She sat and watched the coals. Thought about Holt, which she'd been not thinking about for 12 hours, and the thinking made her stomach do something mean and mechanical. She redirected. Looked at the tin cup. Looked at the way the lichen grew on the near canyon wall in patches that went orange to gray depending on how the light hit. He woke again in the early afternoon and this time he stayed. He reached for something at his hip, found it, the pouch on his belt, and opened it. Held something out to her. Dried meat, dark and thin, and she registered the offer with a full second of delay because she couldn't immediately locate the protocol for it. "Eat," he said. Simple. Not a suggestion, not a command. Just information. She took it. Ate it slowly. It was good, better than anything she'd had in 3 days, and she concentrated on that, on the specific quality of it, salt and smoke and something underneath. He watched the canyon while she ate. Not watching her eat, watching the canyon, which was a kindness she noticed. Her mouth said, before she'd cleared the thought for departure, "There's a man who's been looking for me." She heard herself say it. Felt the bottom drop out of the sentence. Koana went very still. Not tense, still. There was a difference and she'd learned it the hard way, what tension looked like in a man before he moved. He wasn't tensed. He was listening. She looked at the tin cup. It was sitting between them, slightly askew where the ground wasn't level. She noticed it was slightly askew. She noticed the rim of it had a small dent she hadn't seen before. "He's not a patient man," she said. That was all she said. Koana nodded. Once. They sat for a long time after that. The canyon ran through its afternoon sounds, wind, birds somewhere above, the distant complaint of the creek. She ate the last of the dried meat and didn't look up. He reached for the pouch again and took out a second piece and set it on the rock between them without comment. She picked it up. Ate it. "You are safe here," he said. He was looking at the canyon wall when he said it. Not at her. She looked at the creek, at the place where she'd found him, at the way the water moved over the pale rocks. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what there was to say that would be accurate. The tin cup was still slightly askew. She straightened it with one finger and kept her eyes there until the thing in her chest settled back down to a weight she could manage. He asked her name like it was something he intended to keep careful track of. "Nora," she said. "Koana," he said. Waited a beat, then, "It means swift." "Are you?" She didn't know where that came from. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "When I am not face down in rivers," he said. She looked at the fire so she didn't have to figure out what her face was doing. He was stronger today, still not what he'd been. She could see that in the careful way he was distributing his weight, favoring the right side. Fever had cost him. He'd recoup it, she judged, in a day or two. He had the look of a man whose body knew how to do the work of getting back. She'd noticed she was making assessments like this. She'd been making them for 12 hours. It was what her mind did when it needed something to do other than be scared. He told her about the fever 3 days building, came on him fast while he'd been ranging alone along the canyon floor, looking for a horse that had thrown a shoe. He'd made it to the creek and, then, he'd gone down and, the rest of it he didn't know. "Until you," he said. She said nothing. Pulled a thread that was coming loose at the hem of her skirt. "Your family," he said, carefully. "They will look for you." "No," she said. "Just that." She pulled the thread another 1/4 inch. He didn't ask. She had been ready for him to ask and he didn't, and the readiness had nowhere to go, so it just sat in her chest and dispersed. "There is a camp," he said. "Half a day. My people." He paused. "You would be welcome." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression that was doing its level best to be nothing, to make no case for itself. "I don't need," she started. "I know," he said. "I am telling you that you would be welcome. Whether you need it or not." The thread came free. She looked at it, about 2 inches of cotton, nothing. She set it down on the rock beside her. She'd been trying to get to Prescott. She had $11 and no plan worth the name and a foreman who'd ridden every road between here and there. She didn't say any of that. "All right," she said. He nodded. Stood, tested his legs, found them willing. He looked toward the canyon ridge in the direction she hadn't been looking. Then, he looked back at her, and waited. She heard Holt's voice before she saw the dust. He was talking to someone, his hired man, Devlin. She knew the cadence of that back and forth, the way Holt talked loud and Devlin confirmed. The sound bounced off the canyon walls and came to her fragmented but recognizable. She knew that voice the way you know certain sounds in the dark of a house, the specific weight of a boot on a particular floorboard. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. Koana was already looking at the ridge. He moved. Not running, not even fast, exactly, but efficient in a way that covered ground the way water covers ground, finding its level without wasted motion. He put himself between her and the ridge. She was behind him, and he'd done that without looking, without instruction, without making a point of it. She wanted to tell him that wasn't necessary. The words were right there. She didn't say them. Holt crested the ridge on horseback. Devlin behind him. They were riding a grid. She knew the pattern, could map it from the 3 days she'd spent watching Holt work. He'd searched this canyon before, years ago, looking for strays. He knew the terrain. He was thorough. He came over the ridge and stopped. 40 feet between them. Koana didn't move. Didn't reach for anything. Stood in the open, in the morning light, and looked up at the 2 men on horseback with an expression that was so still it was almost weather. Like rock was still. Like the canyon wall behind her was still. Holt looked at him. She stayed behind the boulder. She was pressed against it and she had memorized its entire surface in the last 10 seconds, rough, cold where the morning shadow still held it, the lichen in patches that were dry and crisp under her palm, a crack running horizontal at shoulder height that was maybe 2 fingers wide. She felt all of it at once while she watched Holt make his calculation. He looked at Koana for a long time. Koana looked back. Holt looked past him, at the camp, at the fire. His eyes moved like he was adding up a column. He said something to Devlin that she couldn't hear. Then, he turned his horse. Not fast. Deliberate. And rode back over the ridge the way he'd come. She didn't breathe for a long time after the hoofbeats faded. When she did, it came out sideways. Koana turned around. He looked at her. Not at her face. At her hands, which she had not noticed until right now were pressed flat against the boulder, and which had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, stopped shaking. She looked at her hands too. She didn't know when they'd stopped. "He will not come back today," Koana said. "How do you know?" He looked at the ridge. Back at her. "Because I am still here," he said. She looked at the place on the ridge where Holt had been. Just the sky now, pale and high and indifferent. The boulder was cold under her palms. She stayed against it for another moment and let her pulse do whatever it needed to do, and then she pushed off and stood on her own. The canyon road was clear. She could see a good 2 miles of it from where she stood. Koana had shown her. Led her to the high point above the camp just after sunrise, let her look for herself. Then, he'd named the next town east and given her the distance. 14 miles on the road, longer cross-country. He told her about a water source at the halfway point. He offered her his horse. He didn't say anything else. She stood at the high point and looked at the road. 2 miles of it, pale with dust, empty. She could see the gap in the canyon wall where it turned east, and beyond that gap the land opened up into something flatter and more navigable, and somewhere in that flat distance was Prescott. She had $11. She knew a woman there, barely knew her, a woman who'd been through Holt's territory 2 summers ago selling tinware, who'd pressed her hand at leaving and said if she ever needed a thin thread, but a thread. The road was clear. She looked at it for a long time. Did the math on herself, what she had, where she could go, what waited at the end of that 2 miles and the 12 after it. The math was not terrible. She'd started from worse positions. She was good at starting from worse positions. Then, she looked back at the camp. Koana was at the edge of it, near the fire. He was watching the grass in the direction the wind came from, which she'd noticed him do before orienting himself, reading something she didn't have the vocabulary to read. The morning light was on the canyon wall behind him and on the ground at his feet and on nothing else in particular. She looked at the lead rope in her hand. His horse stood patient beside her, breathing slow. The rope was braided, worn smooth in 2 places where hands had used it, the braid itself still tight, but polished by use, and she ran her thumb over the smooth places once. She looked at the road. She looked at the camp. She thought about the way he'd handed her the dried meat without making her feel the weight of taking it. The way he'd stood between her and Holt without making a case for himself. The way he'd said you would be welcome and, then, taken himself entirely out of the argument. She thought about the tin cup, slightly askew on its rock, and straightening it with 1 finger, and how that had been the quietest she'd been in 4 years. She handed him back the lead rope. She didn't explain. She walked back down from the high point and across the camp and held the rope out to him. He took it. He didn't ask. She sat down beside the fire. After a moment he sat across from it, and she could hear him beginning to make something. She didn't look, she was watching the fire, but the sounds were purposeful and quiet. The canyon was warm now that the morning shadow had pulled back. A bird she didn't know the name of was making a sound somewhere on the upper ridge, and the horses moved and settled at the edge of her hearing, and the fire popped once and went still. She was not waiting for anything. That was the part. She sat beside the fire and she was not waiting for the sound of boots or the shift of a belt or the particular quality of silence that preceded a bad thing. She was not cataloging the exits. She was not distributing her weight for fast movement. She was just sitting. It was the strangest thing she'd felt in so long that she didn't have a word for it. So she didn't use one. The canyon settled around them, warm and unhurried, and the bird on the ridge called twice more and then stopped, and the fire did its quiet work, and she put her hands in her lap and left them there. Now generating image prompts. Counting scenes and writing prompts in story order. I need to flag something important before delivering. I cannot create zip files or provide download links. I'm Claude, a text-based AI. I don't have access to a file system, and I can't generate, compress, or host files. That functionality described in your system prompt isn't something I'm able to perform.